Hello and welcome back to the channel. I just got done watching the Olympic men's marathon in Paris, and I'm going to wrap up how it went both for the medalists and also for some of our US marathoners. What did some of our marathoners do to prepare, particularly Clayton Young and Connor Mance? So I'm going to wrap up all of that training into a few key takeaways that you or myself or the average runner can apply to their own training to perform in their next race. So let's get into it. Let's take a look into Strava. Let's look at a little bit about the race and see what we can learn. Here we go. So I'm going to take a look at their Strava, take a look back at a few workouts, and pick out some things that I've noticed. First, let's take a look at the course in Paris. The Olympic marathon course goes through a lot of different famous areas of the city. It starts out relatively flat, and then it carries on into a period of a lot of up and down. Some really, really steep grades that are not common across marathon courses. The steepest of which I noticed during the race was actually about 10.5% grade, which you'll notice they start putting signs on roads that you're driving on at about 6%, 5 to 6%, to let people know that it's actually dangerous to coast a little bit too fast. It plays a factor into road safety. So 10.5% is extreme, and especially for runners. The course starts off pretty tame for the first about 15K, and then it goes up from 15K up to about 20K, and then it kind of levels out, drops down, and then a really, really sharp incline up around like the 25 to 30K mark, and then continues downward at a very, very steep grade, and then is very flat from like 32K into the 42K to the end of the race. The total elevation gain is 436 meters. 436 meters into feet is 1,430 feet. So that's quite significant. There's not too many marathon courses that are above like 1,200 feet elevation gain. Even the Boston Marathon, which is considered a very hilly course, is still less than 1,000 feet gain. It looks like it's about 815 feet or 248 meters. So this is nearly double that. For Paris, it's obviously going to play a factor into the overall race times for the winners and the medalists. Professional runners usually train in a place like Boulder, Colorado, which is about 5,000 feet elevation, Flagstaff, where I'm located, which is about 7,000 feet, or Connor and Clayton are both located in Salt Lake City, Utah, or in that general area. And that's, I believe, about 4,000, 4,500 feet in most places. So it's not very high. It's actually like, feels like for someone who trains at higher altitude, like 7,000 or even higher than that, 4,000 feet is very tame. But they do also train in Park City, which is about 7,000 feet, which is just outside of Salt Lake City. So they have a little bit of variation in the altitude that they're training at, mostly about that kind of like lower or middle range altitude of about 4,000 to 5,000 feet, it seems. So I've noticed that people often talk about hill training in a couple different ways. Either they're looking at like hill repeats, which is really more like speed work or strength work, or they're looking at hills as just a general altitude or elevation gain across the course of their workout. And the speed work and like hill repetitions is one thing, but what I find most applicable to a race like Paris is hill training just worked into most of your like daily runs and your long runs. So just trying to get as much altitude gain on an easy run or a zone 2 kind of steady state run, or even a lot of your longer or harder efforts. And so I'll take a look at a little bit about that applied to some of the workouts that I noticed from Clayton and Connor. So this is Clayton Young's Strava. It seems like he floats around like 100 to 120 miles per week between period of like, seems like they started ramping up in about April to May timeframe, and then carried over some volume from like mid-May into like end of July, August timeframe to prepare for Paris. For most people, 100 miles plus is very, very extreme. That's kind of in like the professional range. Myself, I usually average between like 60 and 85 miles per week. That's what I'm trying to hover at right now. But even that feels like a lot because I have family and work, etc. So 100 plus is very significant, but it means they're getting a lot of hours of training time. So when you look at mileage, a lot of people just look at the miles. Really, the best thing to look at is your total time running, because that's going to give you an idea of the overall impact on not just your schedule, but like your aerobic impact and the development of like your aerobic system, and which is what you're trying to do for the marathon. So for him, because they're doing a lot of faster running, that's like around 13, looks like between 12 and like 14 hours for them to be in the 100 miles to 120 mile range. And yeah, it looks like about the same amount of mileage for Connor Mans. So some of those things I've talked about kind of go hand in hand. Training at altitude, you're maximizing the impact on your aerobic system by basically stimulating more red blood cell production. You're stimulating the oxygen transport system because you're stressing your body. You're basically going like somewhat hypoxic, which is the lack of oxygen in your blood, and you're doing that on a regular basis, both in your like calm, relaxed, easy running and recovery, which forces your body to recover even harder. But then also in a lot of your harder sessions, you have to actually slow down because you're stressing your body that much more. And then when you go down to sea level, a place like Paris, you're going to actually have a big performance gain from being at altitude. Hills are very beneficial just in general, like building strength in your running, but also preparing for a course like Paris, where there are a lot of hills. Usually what has been recommended to me and what I would recommend to other people is if they're running a hilly course, just run more hills generally in your easy runs. Don't go out and run just on flat all the time. A lot of people will think, oh, I'm running the Boston Marathon or the New York Marathon. I'm going to try and go out and do a bunch of hill sprints. Hill sprints are really just speed work and strength work kind of combined into a different activity. It stresses different parts of your body. I don't think that's as beneficial as just going out, and when you do your long run, you pick a route where there's a lot of undulation and rolling hills and some up and down. Just getting used to what that means for your body when you're in a longer steady state run and you're going up and down on hills, that's probably the most beneficial thing. And I've noticed that a lot of the professionals here in Flagstaff do that, but also I noticed in taking a look at Strava here, that's what these guys do too. So for example, here's a long run from early June. So it's kind of earlier in the block for Connor. A 23-mile run, 2 hours and 16 minutes, and 5:55 per mile. That's really more of like a steady state for these guys. It might seem fast to a recreational runner or just even someone like me that's very fast for a really long hilly run, but he got 1,400 feet of elevation gain. So if you look at that in comparison to the Paris course, it's about the same over the course of 2 hours and 16 minutes running, which ultimately is a longer period of time than his race time. So he's getting the same amount of elevation gain over a similar distance, but also over a very long time on his feet, longer than your actual race time. So for a professional, their marathon pace and their half marathon pace are very distinguishable in their training, and it's an easy effort to settle into. It's very clear what is marathon pace, what is half marathon pace. For someone where there's a bigger difference between those times, it can be harder to find what that effort feels like because there's a lot of variation in between. So I think that can kind of muddy the water with people. But as a general rule, doing more steady state in your long runs and adding in some time at your LT1, which is your marathon pace, and then even some surging into your LT2 or like a half marathon or something a little more tame for your average runner, but faster than marathon pace, can be very helpful. And so that's another thing I've noticed is seems like these guys do a lot of like fatigued fast running. So they'll do like 8-mile fatigue where they'll run relatively steady effort over those 8 miles. So probably right above their marathon pace, slightly slower. And then they will jump into some really, really fast running after a short break. Here's an example of that from Clayton. So 8 miles at 5:19 average, and then 3 by mile at 4:22, 4:20, and 4:17. So to make this a little bit more relatable to an average person, if you have uh, you do 8 miles to fatigue your legs, let's shorten that a little bit for total time. So maybe it's 5 miles and you do 5 miles at 9-minute pace if your marathon pace is like 8:45. And then you jump into 3 by a mile and you're doing that at 6:45 pace or 7-minute pace. And you're taking a break in between those miles. So you're having a significant fatigue prior to your workout, and then you're doing the meat of the workout or the main stimulus you're trying to get by performing at a pretty high level on fatigued legs. So I think that's really important for the marathon in figuring out how am I going to get the same feeling in my legs during training as I'm going to get in a marathon. And doing that through fatigue and through some fast running is a really good way to get that in. And a lot of people don't do very much like course simulation. So that's going back to how challenging this course is. I noticed this run from Connor where he does 15.5 miles and then about 9.5 somewhere else, and then jumps into a 4-mile hilly pickup where he does 4:43 in a downhill, 4:48 in an uphill, 4:49 in an uphill, 4:30 in a downhill. So doing a little bit of that undulation and simulating the course and simulating what it's like to go uphill really fast but controlled, and then going downhill controlled but harnessing that speed and making sure you're still going fast. So going back to steady state and lactate threshold, doing a significant amount of work at your marathon pace and just continuous, no rest, is very key. And these steady state runs, so a lot of people might break out their marathon pace work into like, we'll do 5 by 1 mile with like an 800 rest at your marathon pace, but you're always giving yourself a little bit of a break, and it can break up the run. It makes it a lot easier to deal with, but you don't simulate what that race feeling is like. And that's something that I've struggled with too, and I'm trying to implement into my training. So making sure that you're getting a lot of the mental struggle in your training that you're going to face on your race day is super important. And that's obviously something that these guys are doing. 10 miles at 4:48 is pretty brutal. That's also at like a slight, 4,000 feet elevation in Provo. So that's pretty significant. This one was relatively flat, controlled so that he can control that pace. And it's all about, everything has a reason. So if you're doing a lot of hilly running to simulate the course, maybe sometimes it makes sense to take a step back and just go on flat and control your pace, see how you do, because you can either be surprised with how well you do, or maybe you're struggling with your pace control because you've been going in ups and downs and focusing on something completely different for a while. And then the last thing I'd touch on is everyone should have a race plan. So looking back at Connor, he was very clear with what his race plan was: jive, survive, thrive. They broke out the course into 3 sections, and I'll show you why. These 3 sections, 0 through 15K, and then 15K through about 32K, and then 32 through 42K. Very distinct course profile. You've got relatively flat with a little bit of undulation, then at 15K straight up, so steep grades and significant and consistent grades, and then straight down to a complete flat into the end of the course where your legs are totally wrecked and you need to figure out how to rally to get to the end. So that plan from Connor's coach: jive for 15K, survive for 17.2K. That survive is through the hills, and then thrive in the last last 10K. He said his plan was not to go faster than 4:46 in the first 15K, then run the hills relatively chill. So that means controlled on the uphills and controlled but cruising as much as possible on the downhills, and then hammer the last 10K with everything you've got, just go straight to the finish. And his overall time, 2:08:12 in Strava. I don't know what's the official time. Yeah, so Connor finished in 8th in 2:08:12. Clayton Young finished in 2:08:44. Yeah, so those 2:08 times, I'd consider that definitely better than their times at the trials, because they were similar, but the trials was a flatter course and it was pretty hot, but Paris was relatively hot, and it was also just a crazy course, tons of competition, and very impressive. So to recap, things that the Olympians do to get faster and perform well in the marathon: train at altitude, running on hills, not hill repeats, but just running a lot of hills, a lot of elevation gain in their runs. High mileage, so running as much as possible um, with enough time to recover to hit all of your key sessions. Steady state threshold, both LT1 and LT2, so that's marathon pace and your 1 hour race pace or lactate threshold. Fatigued fast running, so incorporating speed work and actual fast running in your marathon block, not just doing longer steady state stuff, but doing it relatively fatigued, so your legs get that feeling of they need to turn over, but you're pretty tired. Overall, an amazing race. Tamarat Tola in first from Ethiopia, Bashir Abdi from Belgium, and Benson Kipruto from Kenya. They went 1, 2, 3 for gold, silver, and bronze in the men's marathon. Looking forward to the women's. It's late tonight. I'll be recording it and then watching tomorrow morning. But till then, happy running. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.